Today is another Thursday webinar where we are going to be diving in deep. Our theme for the next couple of months is brain science, neuroscience. And I am going to be talking about exactly what goes on under the hood. Why is this relevant to neurodivergence? Well, to understand diversity of thought, we need to understand the brain. The last session we did was a really complex one. We were talking about where does neurodivergence come from? Ideally, we probably should have done this session beforehand because this one is going to be kind of breaking the brain down in little parts. Before, we were talking about the formation of the brain, like, how does it even grow? Incubating a nice little brain. Now we're going to be looking at, okay, the brain is fully grown now. How do we talk about it? How do we cut it up? When we talk about neuroscience, what parts are interesting? Now, if I didn't already do this, my name's Nat. I always forget if I do it or not. So I'm doing my master's in neuroscience. I'm neurodivergent and I support neurodiverse people every single day, even weekends, because for some reason people still phone me. The brain's a difficult subject. But again, if you really want to understand neurodivergence and things like autism and dyslexia, having a basic understanding on this squidgy bit inside our skull is super useful. And it will kind of give you a solid foundation. So while today we aren't necessarily going to be talking about dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD, we do need to know about how the brain at least should look, or most commonly looks for the majority of people, before we can start wondering, all right, what part does what? If this isn't working correctly, what are the outputs, etc. We're a nice bunch, so feel free to search us online. Now, the last one we did was Neurodivergent Brain. And again, really complex webinar. Do check it out. It probably would require a second watch. This was looking at the building blocks. This was about how we grow a brain. When the brain is starting off, what can possibly go wrong? What direction? Where do things work? Where do things not work? And now we've got a fully formed brain. And this is where we're taking on for today. The next step is the brain is made. How do we talk about the brain? So Brain Anatomy 101. Now, this sounds like a proper science class, and it kind of is. But again, really useful foundations in order to progress that knowledge further. There's a lot of people who know how to support people who are neurodiverse, but not necessarily understanding why they are the way they are to begin with. And I think understanding one can really help understand the other. So they kind of go hand in hand, but often we split them into like psychiatry, neuroscience, and don't often combine the two. So if we are successful today, and this is a big if, we are going to be learning about the nervous system organization. How do we organize it? How do we know what does what? We're going to hopefully know about subdivisions. This is just, okay, well, brain, then we've got lobes, and then we've got things, how do we break things down smaller and smaller? And then going even deeper, and we're going to be understanding the brain's internal circuitry. So when we're going to like a real neurominal level, I mean, obviously this is way more zoomed out than what we did last week, but still pretty small compared to most things that we encounter on a day-to-day. Now, to start with, the neurons in our brain, the little cells that talk to each other, hey, you should probably lift your arm up now. All right, I'm lifting my arm up now. 100 billion of them. There are a lot of brain cells. I can't remember. I think there might be more than stars. There are a lot of brain cells. Now, you lose one or two, no big deal. But you lose a lot, you're going to have an issue. And now cells, as we learn, they grow when you're younger. Now, it's been really controversial. Can you develop new neurons? Neurogenesis. I say you can. The research looks promising, but it's still a growing field. So you are born with brain cells and you will lose brain cells over life. But losing a brain cell isn't as bad as it sounds, because there's a thing we spoke about last week called neuroproning, where we try to like trim them, we get rid of the bad ones, just like you would gardening. So losing them isn't necessarily a bad thing, but essentially we do need a lot of them in order to do basic tasks, because maybe you have one thing there and it will spread off, and understanding this will help us a lot as we go on today. Now, already I'm jumping in deep with a challenging question. Look at these images, and I want you to just take a guess if you have no idea. What one is convergence? So essentially in the brain, it's essentially how the information gets spread about. You've got convergent and divergent. You might have heard those terms before, but in the brain, they mean quite a similar thing. So convergence, well, actually, before I give you an answer, let's see what you both said. All right, so we've got the two options is convergence when axons, remember the kind of little bits at the end of the neurons, split into branches to connect multiple neurons. So essentially, one talky cell talks to a lot of talky cells, or is it multiple neurons connecting to a single neuron? So when you've got a lot of information and you're funneling it into one. Those are essentially the two options you get. And it is the second one. Now, just to make it all, again, convergence is when you've got a lot of information and you're kind of consolidating it. You're saying, all right, we don't need all these different branches. Let's focus on one branch and go down the highway. Whereas divergence, when you're talking about having a divergent mind where, you're not limiting yourself, you're open to multiple ideas and opportunities, very similar. And as you can see here, it's when the axons split into branches and to connect to multiple neurons. So all we mean, if we talk about convergence and divergence, we just talk about how the information is shared. Is it funneled down one route or is it spread out into multiple routes? Again, the words might seem a bit disorientating, but what it's saying is hopefully quite easy. It's just how the information is shared. The next one is neural networks. Now, you might have heard this term like all over the place lately with like Elon Musk and supercomputers. Essentially, they're trying to make computers act like a human brain, but our brain had been doing it for a lot longer. And this is, again, just how information is shared. So essentially, when you have an idea, it's not a linear path. It's not like one brain cell says, lift your hand up, and the next brain cell lifts your hand up. It goes multiple routes. And it might go to another layer, then go to another one, and it will bounce back a bit. Sometimes it's not the quickest route. Sometimes it is. Sometimes they'll put more energy and get one really strong. And if you remember when we talked about neurodivergence, we're saying when people say our brains are wired differently, it normally means that the way we go about finding different solutions is just a different path. Not necessarily wrong, just a different path. And this isn't just a way of describing neurodivergence. This is also what is going on a neuro level. So it's nice, I don't like spreading fake news. And I think it's always great to understand that these kind of analogies are actually based on something a bit more tangible. So though this is a bit wordy, I'll read this through because it's useful. Convergence, remember we just spoke about that, and divergence in the nervous system. The nervous system is just like the brain and the stem cord. It's the kind of our main hub. Create multiple pathways for signals to travel between cells. So there's multiple ways. Imagine this, like if you want to get to London, you can take the motorway, you can take the A road, you can take little roads, you could probably fly. There's multiple routes depending on what you need. If you need to get somewhere really fast, you might fly. If you don't mind a more scenic route, you might take the quieter roads. So there's multiple ways of the brain doing anything. And this is also why you can lose a few brain cells and be completely fine, because there's multiple ways of doing the exact same thing. Like having different roads to reach destinations, the signals can take different routes. And as neurodiverse people, we just take different routes. That's all it is. People with autism take a different route to those with ADHD and take different routes to those who are neurotypical. Each route actively activates different cells along the way. I kind of imagine it's like pitching up hitchhikers, like learn different bits of information and taking your way there. As a result, different outcomes and effects occur in the brain depending on the chosen route. Again, just like driving, if you take a more scenic route, you might be a bit delayed, but you might be more relaxed. If you take a flight, you're not doing great for the environment, but it's getting you there quick, but you had to wait in the airport. So depending how our brains work, again, not a right nor wrong, but there is, of course, trade-offs. So sometimes you might struggle to take in other information at the same time, very similar to autism. Other times you might be really alert and really kind of focused like ADHD, but you might get really worn out and not be able to keep that same pace up. So the networks that our brains connect have a big impact on everything we do. Again, the classic example is the London Underground, and I want you all to have a guess at how many different ways from Waterloo to King's Cross are there. And it's the same analogy that I just used with driving. Honestly, I have no idea. So you're not going to get an answer at the end of this. But if you see, it's very tiny, but Waterloo's down there, King's Cross is up there. I mean, 100, why not? Now, of course, I normally take this route. So from King's Cross, I swear I normally take the Jubilee. Is that not connected though? Oh, maybe I think I might take the Victoria or and then Jubilee. I don't know. There's different routes, right? And this is important because you've got the quickest route, then you've got the cheapest route, then you've got the route which is better for the environment. Then you can walk, you could take a taxi, you could take a bus. There's so many different routes. And I would say no one would say any route you take on the underground is necessarily wrong. It depends on your preference. It depends on the time of the day. It depends on your budget. So the brain is doing a lot of different things. Okay, now I'm guessing someone will probably end up Googling this and find the right answer. I think ultimately it's endless. It just depends how quick you want to get somewhere. So yeah, lots of different ways of the brain doing different things. And it also means that, say, if there's a blockage, a leaf on the track, whatever, the brain can rewire itself and go a different route. And when you're neurodiverse, your brain is going a different route. Sometimes that route isn't going to be the quickest route. That's okay. It's just finding its other place. And sometimes, let's say if a route is like too congested, like the central line, the brain might decide to create the Elizabeth line. Or it might decide to extend the central line and make it bigger. So the brain is what we call plasticity, where it can kind of move, create, grow, shrink, die, crop. It's a very kind of agile environment. Oh, April says the easiest way for me to get to Northern Line from King's Cross is to Euston Bank Branch, take the Northern Line, Euston Waterloo. Nice. Now, in terms of how the brain makes these decisions, think of it also a bit like a flow chart. So we've got the general organization of the nervous system. And remember, the nervous system is essentially everything. It's the brain and the cord that goes down us, which essentially does everything. From wiggling your toes to thinking about your day, it does everything. So we've got the nervous system. This is the big boss. Then we've got the central nervous system. This is like the hub. And then you've got kind of offshoots. And essentially all of these together allow your body to do what it needs to do, whether or not it's under your kind of senses, its movement. It does everything. Now, today we are going to be mainly focusing on the nervous system and the central nervous system because they're the nearest to the brain, but obviously it is all connected. But this is how you might want to like divide it up. So nervous system, it's not a cell that is like kind of shivering and scared. I don't know why it's called nervous, but it is. And as you can see, the nervous system, we've got the brain there and we've got like the main kind of cord, and it sprouts off to other areas. Now, the top bit, it will kind of choose our sight, our vision, breathing, heart. It does everything. And we've actually been able to pinpoint which kind of like direction it goes off to. But easiest way to understand it is like a motorway that kind of branches off into smaller A roads and little kind of country roads. And the bigger the road, the more information that gets sent down it. It is also why if you ever have a nervous cell damage, it can be really difficult, if not impossible to fix, just because these routes are super important. Now, have a little look at these images, and I want you to tell me which one is the central nervous system. Remember, this is like the main place where all the good stuff happens. There's different kind of routes, what you might be called. So a neuron is classified as a NSC, that's a central nervous system neuron, if it is entirely located in the brain and or spinal cord. On the other hand, if any part of the neuron, such as the dendrites, axon cell bodies, these are just like the parts that are connected to the neuron or part of the neuron, extend outside of the brain or the cord, it is considered, I think, DNS. Like, we'll never know because it kind of cut off. But as you're right, this one is the correct one. You see, it's the brain and the main spinal cord. This is what we talk about when we talk about the central nervous system. And it's a really, really, really old part of our bodies in terms of evolutionary speaking. It's one of the oldest parts. If you look at us when we were like, I don't know, little kind of fish growing out the ocean, it was one of the first things to develop. And it's all these little offshoots which came much, much later. Now we're going to look about how do we actually talk about the brain. It's, rather than saying, that squidgy bit on the left, go around the right corner, up the stairs, down the stairs, we do actually have proper ways of talking about the brain. Unfortunately, like most things, it's confusing. I don't know why. Well, we do know why, and we're going to explain it. So we split people up with axons and planes. And where we'd think, okay, the front, back, left, it's different because we stand on 2 legs. We want it to be difficult. All the other animals are on 4 legs. We stand up. And that is an important thing to remember when you're kind of working out what direction are we talking about the brain. So as you can see here, how it kind of splices up. They're the exact same. The only difference between animals and humans is because we stand up on 2 legs, it makes it a bit more confusing, but they are in the same place. Here's another example of how we kind of like cut humans up, so how we know when to talk about things. This is done in the brain and the body. I won't go into too much detail, but the most important thing to know is that when we talk about the brain, we talk about it as if we're kind of slicing a big thing through the middle or the side. So have a look at these images, and I want you to guess, or if you know already, what is the coronal view? Yes. Okay, so the coronal view is a front to back brain cross-section aiding in diagnosis disorders using MRI and CT scans. Quite useful because the way I always remember it is as in crown. Okay. Well, we've got very mixed views here. Yeah, this one. And I know it can kind of get a bit confusing, but there is a way that I like to remember what all these different brain compartments are talking about. Because remember, like if you go to the doctor and you say, oh, my brain hurts, not that useful. But if you know the exact part which you're talking about, it just makes life so much easier. So this is how I remember how I split the brain up. The coronal part is Latin for crown, which goes on the head. So you see here, the bit that kind of slices down the middle, because it's on the very top of the head, just like a crown. Nice. Then we've got the horizontal one, parallel to the horizon. So as the sun kind of comes out of the sky, that is how I remember that part of the brain. And the last one is sagittarial, I mean. Sagittal, yes. And sagittal is the name of the archer, in the sky. And if you see it, it's how you would stand doing an arching position. None of these are perfect, but it's a pretty good way to remember things if you struggle to remember how you slice your brains up. Not that I imagine a lot of you will be doing it that often, but still good to know. So the nervous system, as we mentioned, can be divided. Just like in the body, we can do it sideways, lengthways, upways, downways, and we can also split it in apart. Now, if any of you have ever seen a brain, it actually doesn't look like the images. In the images, things are nicely colored, they are clearly separated, but in reality, it's not quite as simple. So normally we have to dye the brain, cut the brain, or kind of choose what parts are more important to us at that time. The key elements of the nervous system is the forebrain, the midbrain, the hindbrain, and the spinal cord. So forebrain, as in front, is at the front. Midbrain, as you can guess, is in the middle. Hindbrain, as in your backside, is at the back of the head. And the spinal cord is that kind of long line there. Those are the most typical ways that we use to explain a brain. Now, if we focus on the spinal cord at the moment, and this is a really important part, it's not just bone. It is like the major highway. This is the kind of most important way of getting information from your brain to any part of your body. And as you can see here, we've got kind of gray matter, white matter. Now, we talk about gray and white matter in the brain quite often. In the spinal cord, it's just reversed. It's just different colors, to be honest, and it has like different kind of strengths. It also has all our nerves on. It's where our tissue and our muscle connects to. A really important thing. This is why if you ever have spinal cord damage, like I mentioned, it's really not easy to fix. So you need to look after your spine, not just for movement, but because it is where all our information is sent to and from. Now, which letter does the spinal cord cross-section of the grey matter resemble? This is just a way that I use to remember about the spinal cord, to be honest with you. Does it really matter what shape it is? Not so much. But whenever I see this letter, I know we're talking about the spinal cord. So if you remember kind of like that image I showed earlier, if you don't remember, completely fine. Just take a guess. It can only be 1 or 26, so you can't go too wrong. H, yeah, the correct answer is H. And okay, nice. And I'll show you, if you see here again, you see that H. And this essentially, if you've got your spinal cord and sliced it in half, you would see a H. And that's just like different density. Now, we spoke about the nerves. Now, the nerves are the part of the spinal cord which sends the information. It's mixed nerves, it conducts, it can control everything from motor skills, which is moving your body, sensory to feeling things, touching things, tasting things. This is the part which, without it, our bodies just wouldn't work. It's completely crucial. And you might be thinking, well, now we're getting a little bit further away from the brain now. Well, the brain isn't just this part here. It is a control system which connects to every area. So I think you can't really talk about the brain without talking about the spinal cord. Now, the stem is that bit that branches off from the brain and goes into the spinal cord. Again, one of the oldest parts of the brain. Everything here in that kind of darker purple is the oldest part of the brain. The pons, the cerebella, all our classic brain friends. So this part of the brain controls our swallowing, arousal, our mood, our movement, our sleep. And if you think about the kind of oldest part of human evolution, these are the most primitive. These are the things which are essential for human existence. These are our automatic processes. So the newer the brain gets, the more autonomy we have over it. But the older parts of the brain, the more automatic the systems are. And it's a good way of kind of seeing how kind of smart an animal is, because the smaller their brains are, the less developed they are, and they'll probably be more basic, just like this area. But the more developed an animal becomes, the more likelihood they can have independent thought. This is why we look at like elephants or chimpanzees, or dolphins, incredibly intelligent animals. So let's focus a bit more on the forebrain. And this is the newest part of the brain in terms of evolution. This is what makes us different from animals. It is the largest part of the brain, and it comprises the cerebral hemispheres. Now, on this brain, I want you to put a little pin on where you think the visual processing area is. We talked about the central part of the brain, but where the vision part of our brain is not often where people think it is. Nice, nice. I can see we've definitely got some correct answers there. It is this part. And it's interesting to remember that though our eyes are at the front, the visual processing part of the brain, the optical lobe, is at the right back here. So if anyone kind of bashes you in the back of the head, it's why your vision can kind of, blinker up a bit. It's not where you'd think. And for these lobes, we divide them into different areas. So we've got the frontal lobe, the parental lobe, the optical lobe, the temporal lobe, cerebellum. And again, these areas aren't really cut and dry. If you would cut a brain up, you wouldn't see kind of clear lines. Some of these, you would notice them by like really deep wrinkles and creases. Other areas would just kind of blur into the others. But we need to have an area in order to speak about it. Now, you often see people say, oh, that's your frontal lobe, that's the problem, or this part of the brain is controlling this part of you. Not really true. While, for instance, like the optical lobe will play the biggest part in your visual processing, it takes the whole brain in order to do it. Remember how we talked about neural pathways and how your brain will choose pathways. Now, it has its preferred preference. It will always want to go one way. But if one area gets severed or damaged or develops differently, it can reroute that and go different routes as well. The brain is really placid in terms of being able to shape and move things around. Now on here, just some quick true or false. You tell me what you think. We've got functions are associated with certain lobes. Kind of just gave that away. But again, it's a bit of a grey answer. So our parts of the brains associated with certain actions. Then we got a lobe is associated with just one function. So remember when we cut the brain up, one bit only does one bit. And lastly, no function is only located in just one lobe. I feel like I kind of gave the answers before I gave these questions. So I hope most of them are correct, but we will see. Correct. False, correct. So functions are associated with certain lobes. Yes, and the key word here is associated. So it doesn't mean they are completely like if you were to say the front brain is where you move your arms, the back part of the brain controls your vision. Yes, they are associated with them. Yes, when we go in MRI machines, that's where like the most activity is, but it's not the only part of the brain. It is why some people can lose parts of their brain and still completely function, where other people might not be able to. It depends on a number of factors. Then we got a lobe is associated with just one function. Absolutely not. A lot of the time we like to say, oh, that's the part that controls your digestion, that controls your breathing. We do it to simplify things, to make learning easy and fun. But the truth is, our lobes are all equally as important. And if you ever heard this thing where we only use 10% of our brains, not true. We use our entire brain, but some parts are activated more heavily than others. And the last one, no function is only located in just one brain. That's true. We literally, there's activity in all over the brain. No matter what you do, just some areas have higher levels of activity. So in short, the brain's complex. There's a lot going on. Today, I told you like some few key areas of how we split the brain up. But depending who you're talking to, depending on different countries, depending on what you're hoping to understand, you can split the brain up in so many different ways. And every little area has a kind of different name. Some areas are contended and not everyone agrees upon them. It's a mess. But if you just rely on like the different kind of lobes, the front brain, midbrain, back brain, cerebellum, most people kind of will know what you're on about. But it's also worth knowing that if you were to read different books or try to learn more about neurodivergence, some of the names that come up might not be ones you're familiar with. Remember, we've got English names, old names, Latin names, depending what source you get at, the terminology can be a bit different. Now, moving a bit on to, okay, the brain. Now, what does it actually do? I want to look at the connections in the forebrain that send sensor information to the cortex. So remember the front brain, sending it to the cortex. Now, these are all sensory areas. There's not really a right or wrong answer to this, but out of curiosity, I want you to rank them in terms of which ones you think are the most important. We always play this game where like, okay, if you were to lose one sense, which one would it be? And it's difficult. Like no one ever wants to lose vision. That normally always wins. Auditory is hearing. Well, hearing is important. Smell, I'd happily lose smell. I got hay fever, but actually smell is really important. It stops us from eating poisonous food because we can smell when things have gone off. And also without smell, our taste wouldn't be nearly as good. So smell and taste go hand in hand. And touch and tactile perception, again, sounds a bit boring compared to the others. Really important. If you don't know how hard, like pressure much you put on something, you could like break things every time you pick them up like the Hulk. Or you might not be able to feel them, or maybe you touch a stove and it's really hot, but you aren't registering. Interestingly enough, these are all areas that neurodivergent people can struggle with, from kind of visually being able to kind of pick things out. For instance, they might be very good at things like Where's Wally or Waldo, or not. Auditory, we hear the whole selective hearing. Normally it contributed to men, but I can tell you it affects all genders. Touch and process, a lot of people who are neurodiverse are oversensitive or undersensitive when it comes to stimulation. Smells, we can find extremely they can smell way worse or way better. And again, for taste, it's why some people who are neurodiverse have quite a mild palate, because flavors are just extra intense to them. These are all areas in the brain which can work differently depending on how your brain is wired. Now, there's two ways which the brain sends information. We've got ascending information or descending information. Ascending information is sensory. So if your eyes see something, it sends it straight to the brain. If you feel something, straight to the brain. Touch, smell. So anytime when you are taking information from the outside world into the brain, it goes ascending. Now, if, however, you want to do something like move, so for instance, you see a ball coming towards your face, that is ascending information. Descending is when you might reach out and grab it. But to grab it, It isn't your hand telling your brain to move, it is your brain telling your hand. But if you hear something, it is your ears telling your brain. Sounds pretty basic, I know, but still a really important part when it comes to understanding what's working, what's not working. So with neurodiverse people, are the key areas in ascending connections or descending? Well, most would say ascending, but for instance, dyspraxia can also affect motor coordinations. Autism is more ascending. So when we talk about neurodiversity, just remember we're talking about diversity, people being very, very different. So if you support one type of connection, it's not going to have much impact on the other form of connection. Now, in the brain, how is all of these things held together? Well, we have like motorways in the brain. There's lots of different connections and they're all different strengths. So you see these fibers, these are like the cables that kind of hold the brain together. I sometimes think of them like when you see bridges, while you might have a really strong bridge, it needs to have these cables in order to kind of keep it nice and strong. Different pathways in the brain help with different parts of communicating. So with some people, these cables will be extra thick and sturdy. Others will be weak and not really that strong. And depending on these different fibers will depend on how good of a communicator you are, how fast you are responding. People with dyspraxia normally struggle with rapid response. People with autism often have quite a weak connection and don't kind of process it. This is why you might say some areas are really observant, really spot on, other areas over the head. And it's because some areas are extra strong, other areas are weaker than the average person. And depending on how these connections all link up with each other, will often determine on how you respond to the world and how the world responds to you. Remember, ascending or descending. So some of these connections are a one-way track, others go both ways, others go either way. Quite similar to when you've got charging cables. Some charging cables will allow you to charge your phone only, where other charging cables will allow you to send information from, say, the computer to the phone. Some will be really thick and you will be able to use for years. Others will probably break after a week. Not too dissimilar. Now, how do we actually figure this stuff out? Well, one way of learning about the brain and understanding all these pathways is through a technique called DTI, Diffusion, Tensor, Tractography. And this is a CGI computer model of it, but it's a really good way of seeing which pathways are being used. Have you ever kind of done those things where you kind of zoom out, or when you're flying a plane and you look at the ground and you see all the roads that are lit up from cars, and you're able to see what roads are really lit up, are the roads that are being used most, and what roads are not being lit up? And this is a really great way of knowing how the brain works. Now, obviously, larger roads will have more use. Makes sense. But let's say you're in this aeroplane and you see, say, the M5 and it's completely dark. Well, you know that pathway should be completely lit up at this time. But if it's not, then there's something wrong going on. So this technique is how we kind of determine what pathways are working, which pathways are not, what ones are strong, which ones are more activated. Do certain elements kind of make more people use them? For instance, if there's a loud noise, is certain pathways going to light up more, or are they going to dim down? And how does that compare to someone else who doesn't have any neurodevelopmental conditions, for example? So a quick roundup of this, and I appreciate this really has been a bit of a whirlwind tour, but it's just to get everyone on the same page and to have a basic starting point on when we talk about the brain, what are we actually talking about? We spoke about the nervous system that can be divided and how it works or how it looks. Remember, the nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. That is the part which makes us do what we do. The central nervous system, which is often abbreviated to CNS, is divided into hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain, and also cerebellum. That's probably the easiest one to remember. We also talked about convergence and divergence, essentially what way the brain information is going. Is it kind of sending an information and saying, tell as many people as possible? Or is it kind of consolidating and picking one route? We also learned a little bit about neuroimaging techniques, such as how we understand the pathways in the brain. There's so many different ways of doing this. You could use radiation, you can use different chemicals, you can use, there's lots of different techniques, but fMRI is the most common one when it comes to scanning the brain, seeing what areas light up the most. And this is normally the way that we do use to understand neurodivergence. Now, as a lot of you will probably know, when it comes to diagnosing people, we use psychiatry. It's about understanding characteristics and kind of people's day-to-day routine. At the moment, we aren't able to locate a particular area, which means, you definitely have autism. But in the future, this might be a possibility. So we're probably going to be looking at a more hybrid approach, the more understanding that we get in terms of what areas affect different areas. But if you're wondering why we can't do that already, remember how I said the brain does different things. There isn't one part of the brain which lights up that says you have autism. It's a whole brain working together and choosing different routes. And this is why it's incredibly difficult, and some may even argue impossible, that we can't pinpoint a particular area. Because autism isn't one thing, it's a collection of people who think in different ways. Now, I mention this each week, but it's always important too. If any of you do resonate with having neurodevelopmental issues and are in the workplace, you should get into contact with us because we can offer free support. It's one of the main things we do, apart from giving these talks once a week. Now, the next one, we're going to be kind of continuing along the same path, but this time we're going to be talking about neurons and glia cell. Now, this is, again, we're zooming back in a bit more now. Neurons are the talking cells, but exactly what are they? I often talk about them in a really simple way. Let's talk a little bit deeper about them. And then glia cells. Why does no one ever talk about glia cells? These are super important cells. A lot of the time, people thought that neurons was like the boss and the glia cells were like the scaffolding, kind of like holding them up, because otherwise you just got cables all around your head and it's chaos. And the glia cells are what kind of wraps them up in nice little packages, which makes things neat and tidy. But now we're learning that glia cells are really important and have their own functions. So we're going to be learning a bit more about this. I appreciate this is a niche subject. It isn't going to be everyone's. But again, the more you know about these things, the more you're able to start to piece together how your own mind works. The next thing to know, if you did enjoy today and you want to learn more, we have recorded webinars on our YouTube, which you can just Google exceptional individuals. We're also recorded this webinar, which hopefully will be uploaded relatively soon. We also have Facebook groups. Now, I appreciate not everyone might use them these days, but if you wanted to, we have a nice community where people share thoughts, ideas, questions that pop into their head later. You can just type exceptional individuals opportunity groups, or you can use this another QR code. It's a growing community and people are very friendly and they share a lot of opportunities like jobs, support strategies, interesting articles. We also have a LinkedIn community, which is growing. This is aimed at professionals who are looking to get jobs in inclusive industries. So we try and share job opportunities with employers that we have trained. Definitely worth a check out. We're still kind of growing this platform at the moment, but definitely one to watch. Type exceptional individuals in LinkedIn if you do have an account. And last of all, here is our contact information. So exceptionalindividuals.com. On this, you can get free support, coaching, mentoring, workplace needs assessment. We have different characteristic quizzes and lots of helpful blogs and articles which can help people who are neurodiverse trying to understand their brains more. Or if you're a professional trying to support people, it can also be quite useful. My email is just nat@exceptionalindividuals.com if you want to get in contact directly, or if you just want a general question, feel free to email our admin. Now, I hope you all found that useful. A bit of a shorter session, but I didn't want to overwhelm people with this information, particularly because it's not what we normally cover. But anyway, I hope you found it useful, and hopefully I'll see you next week when we're talking about neurons and glia cells, which honestly is more interesting than it sounds. Appreciate everyone. Have a great rest of your Thursday, and I'll see you shortly.